Folks, a very rare and wonderful thing is happening, which is that I'm actually making a video on something topical. Of course, the Odyssey is topical because of the Christopher Nolan movie coming out about a month from when I'm recording this, and every time a major film adaptation of a famous work of literature is coming out, I tell myself that I'm going to get around to reading the book first so that I can be one of the annoying people who can go around telling people that I read it first and pointing out all the differences. And this time I actually managed to do it. Now, the reason I felt compelled to make this video is because this is a story that, like everyone, I kind of thought I knew. But then of course when I finally got around to reading it, I discovered that it's very different from the kind of simplified version of the story that gets told in pop culture. Looking back, I think my first encounter with this story was reading the Tales from the Odyssey series as a child by Mary Pope Osborne, the Magic Treehouse author. As for the original text itself, I had read part of it back in high school, I think, but then for some reason I stopped reading it, and I'm not really sure why, because I remember enjoying it and wanting to keep reading, and then I got distracted or something. That happens a lot. With all that being said, here I don't really want to bother with a summary of the story because I think that most people kind of get the gist of it already. It's the story of Odysseus and his men after the Trojan War trying to come home and constantly failing to do so for a variety of reasons, until eventually Odysseus finally makes it home without his crew, who all die along the way. And when he gets there, he finds out that his home has been taken over by a bunch of dudes who are trying to marry his wife, and so he kills them all. Now, the way that this story is structured in the poem itself is not the way that the story is usually told. The famous sections of the Odyssey, the bits about the Cyclops and the Sirens and the journey to Hades and Circe and all of that, are all concentrated in this one small section of the poem called the Apologos, or Apologos, which constitutes only books 9 through 12, and there are 24 books in the poem as a whole. Pretty much everything else in the poem is stuff that is not really as famous. Like the first 4 books in the poem are about Telemachus, Odysseus' son, going around trying to find Odysseus. Odysseus is not even introduced until book 5, which is like 100 pages into the story. And then basically books 13 through 24, the entire second half of the poem, is the Nostos section of the story, the homecoming. And this is the most slow burn, drawn out section of the poem, especially in comparison to the Apologos sections, where some of the most famous stuff, the stuff that everybody knows, is covered in the span of a couple pages. Like the whole bit with Scylla and Charybdis, where Odysseus has to navigate this narrow strait between a giant sea monster on one side and a giant whirlpool on the other, the part that was always my favorite part of the story as a kid, that only lasts like 100 lines maybe. It's very quick. But the odd structure of this poem is not the biggest way in which it differs from the way that most people think about it. The biggest differences are in the way that it differs from modern storytelling conventions. Now, here is where I feel I should say that because this is a topical video, there are already a ton of videos on YouTube right now talking about the Odyssey. And in fact, just as I was getting ready to record this, I saw that Angela Collier posted a video talking about some of the same things that I'm going to be talking about here, about the weirdness of Odysseus as a character, and so I'm going to try to avoid treading the same ground. But specifically regarding Odysseus as a character, one of the things I was most struck by and most surprised by is just how little agency he has in the narrative. Almost everything that happens in the poem, almost all of the famous events that he is generally credited with, are things that he did not himself conceive of doing. The character as presented in the poem is entirely contrary to the well-known cultural depictions of him as this great hero. There was this one kind of silly tweet going around a little while ago when people are arguing about the Odyssey on Twitter, as they perennially do, where the author wrote, "Homer is the original great man theorist of history. He's not telling you the Trojans lost the war because of climate change. He's telling you the tale of Hector, Odysseus, and Achilles." Leaving aside the whole great man theory of history element of this tweet, I can sort of see a case for Achilles and Hector being portrayed as these figures who have a tremendous amount of influence over the narratives that they find themselves involved with. It's certainly true in the Iliad that the tide of battle is portrayed as changing dramatically just because one person comes into the fray, especially Achilles. But in the Odyssey, that could not be farther from the truth. Odysseus has almost no agency in the story whatsoever. Just to give a few examples of what I'm talking about, when Odysseus is on the island of Circe and she's turning all his men into pigs, the plan that he comes up with to outwit her comes at the behest of Hermes, who literally comes to him and gives him a magic potion and tells him what to do. Then when he goes to the land of Hades to visit Tiresias so he can figure out how to get home safely, that is not his plan either. Circe just tells him to do that and gives him a very vague explanation for why he needs to do that, and he just kind of goes along with it. Then again, when he's stuck on the island of Calypso, Calypso just keeps him there for years against his will. And the only reason he leaves is because Athena goes and begs Zeus and is like, hey, we need to let him get home. And so they send Hermes over there to tell him to go home, basically. Then when he finally makes it home to Ithaca, his whole plan to disguise himself as a beggar so he can infiltrate his house and take out the suitors comes at the behest of Athena, who tells him in exact detail everything that he needs to do in order to execute this plan. This is all in stark contrast to the way that Odysseus is not only depicted in pop culture, but depicted in the poem itself as this cunning manipulator and master strategist. He does have a knack with coming up with lies on the spot, like for example when he comes home to Ithaca and he talks to his swineherd Eumaeus, he comes up with a very detailed backstory for the person he's playing, the beggar that he's playing, which Athena did not give him. He seems to come up with this on the spot. But still, the whole plan is Athena's plan in the first place. He's just kind of filling in the details. Ironically, one of the only times when he shows any agency at all is when he is visiting the land of the Cyclops, and that agency gets him into a tremendous amount of trouble. First of all, he goes into the Cyclops' cave when he probably shouldn't really be doing that. Then when he finally escapes with his men and he's on his ship and he's sailing away, he can't help but yell back and taunt the Cyclops and tell him, haha, it was I, Odysseus, who outwitted you and blinded you and took your eye. Before this, he had famously not revealed his identity, referring to himself as nobody. And now, for no reason at all, except to just boost his own ego, he is telling his identity to the Cyclops, who immediately prays to Poseidon, his father, to prevent Odysseus from getting home. And that's the reason for the entire Odyssey happening in the first place. And that brings me to the second weird thing about Odysseus as a character, which is that he doesn't really change at all as a result of anything that happens to him over the course of this narrative. Like, if this were a modern story, an episode like that we would expect to be treated as a kind of moral lesson, right? We would expect that Odysseus, after taunting the Cyclops and getting himself into tremendous trouble as a result, would learn, hey, maybe I shouldn't be so boastful, maybe I shouldn't be so impulsive, maybe I should just chill out a little and not let my anger get the best of me and lead me to making stupid decisions. But he doesn't ever really have a moment like this, and in fact, even the poet doesn't really seem to blame Odysseus for the whole Odyssey. At the very beginning of the poem, the poet blames Odysseus's men for the Odyssey because they feasted on the cattle of the sun and so brought death onto themselves. Which, yeah, that is clearly a thing that they were not supposed to have done, but the only reason they were there in the first place is because Odysseus taunted the Cyclops, who cursed them to have to wander the earth forever before they could get home. And the reason I say that Odysseus doesn't grow as a result of anything that happens is because he's the same at the beginning of the story as at the end. When he's visiting the land of the Phaeacians, which is the second to last stop on his journey home to Ithaca, there's this really weird scene where he gets taunted by one of his host Alcinous' men, who is taking part in all these games and invites Odysseus to join him, and Odysseus, who has been on this 10-year Odyssey and is like completely weak and broken, is like, no, I don't really want to. And then he taunts him and it's like, oh, I bet you're just a weakling, you're just a wimp, you don't want to go up against me. And then Odysseus just completely loses it. He lashes out at the guy and gets really angry, and so out of spite decides to take part in the sports competition anyway. And of course he beats everybody because he's Odysseus and he's so good at everything. But probably the most striking example of what we would see now as impulsiveness and egotism is what he does to the maidservants in his house, who were really the slaves in his house, who were unfaithful to him by sleeping with the suitors while he was away, which is that he hangs them all, he kills them all. And there's never really any moment of moral doubt about this decision. And the same thing goes for the suitors, who arguably did not all deserve to die because they were not all being evil, but who he kills anyway, despite knowing that this is going to anger everybody in Ithaca and maybe start up an uprising against him. And indeed it does start an uprising against him, and the only reason that uprising is quelled is because Athena comes in and basically tells everybody to stop fighting. So once again, at the very end of the poem, the last thing he does is do something kind of impulsive and merciless and rash, which causes a massive problem that is only resolved by one of the gods coming in down to intervene. That's not really character growth, right? Like, that's not really a satisfying character arc by today's standards. But the end result of all this weirdness is that I ended up asking a lot of questions about this poem that I wasn't expecting to have to ask, and that I'm also not sure the poet intended me to ask in the first place. Of course, it's impossible to know what the poet, insofar as there even was one, because that's a whole other discussion, intended the reader to think while reading this poem. It was produced in an entirely different cultural context according to artistic principles that are entirely alien to us nowadays. And we don't even know if Homer was a real person, or which sections of the poem that we have today were always there and which were added later, or whether there are sections that were deleted later. We don't know. We have no choice but to analyze the text that we have today as if it is the final, complete piece of work. An example of the kind of question I'm talking about, though, is the question of why Odysseus needed to disguise himself upon returning home to Ithaca in the first place. At first, the answer seems pretty simple. It's because suitors have taken over his house, and he needs to infiltrate the house in order to get all the weapons out of the room where the suitors are partying so that he can kill them all easily. But the thing is, when you read the poem, there's a lot more nuance. For one thing, it's not entirely clear that all of the suitors need to die. Some of them, especially Antinous, the kind of main bad guy of the suitor group, plotted to kill Telemachus as he was coming home from his search for his father, which is obviously a very bad thing that they shouldn't have done. But for some of them, their only real crime was trying to win the heart of Penelope. The other thing is that when he's disguised as a beggar and he's inside his house and he's going around from table to table trying to win food from these people, they're not really that rude to him. Like, Odysseus seemed to have expected them to be rude to him. Indeed, he tells Telemachus beforehand, who now knows that he is Odysseus, not to interfere if the suitors attack him or ridicule him or anything, so that, you know, he doesn't give away his father's identity. But the suitors are mostly fine towards him. They grumble about him being there, but they give him plenty of food. Indeed, he gets so much food from them that it's hard not to think that being a beggar must have been incredibly lucrative in ancient Greece if this is the kind of thing you could get away with, just going into a rich person's home and going around from person to person waiting for them to give you massive chunks of meat. And so what Odysseus ends up having to do is he kind of taunts them a little bit. He kind of provokes them. And eventually this causes one of them to throw a chair at him, I believe. But even then, it's because Odysseus is doing a really bad job of disguising himself as a beggar. He's being incredibly haughty. And then, of course, there is the whole thing with Penelope, which Angela Collier already talks about this in her video, so I don't want to reiterate the point too much. But it is true that this is not a love story. Odysseus and Penelope don't really seem to like each other very much. Odysseus is incredibly suspicious of Penelope to a degree that seems insane by today's standards. He refuses to give his identity to her, and when they finally are reunited, she doesn't believe that he is who he says he is. And so their meeting is incredibly tense. He kind of gets angry at her for not believing him. And one thing I was not expecting is that the poem does make an explicit comparison between these two, Odysseus and Penelope, and Agamemnon and Clytemnestra, whose story is like deliberately compared to theirs on multiple occasions. When Odysseus goes to the land of the dead and he meets Agamemnon there, and he's like, hey, dude, you were in the Trojan War with me and you survived, what's going on? Agamemnon tells him that he was killed by his wife and her new lover, and then the two go on a long diatribe about how much women suck. And I think this is clearly what sets the stage for Odysseus being suspicious of Penelope when he comes home. He wants to test her. He wants to find out if she has been faithful to him while he's away, which he hasn't been faithful to her, but apparently that doesn't really matter. And while we're on the subject of Odysseus's misogyny, we also have to talk about his relationship with Eurykleia, the nurse who cared for him when he was a kid. There is one scene where Eurykleia is bathing his feet and recognizes a scar on his leg, and suddenly realizes that he is Odysseus. He's not the beggar he's claiming to be. Penelope is standing right there while this is happening, but Athena shields her mind from noticing what's going on, so she just kind of magically doesn't notice this interaction that ensues. When Eurykleia recognizes him, Odysseus' reaction could not be less enthusiastic. Unlike when he reveals his identity to Telemachus or to his swineherd Eumaeus, he makes it pretty clear that she was not supposed to know who he was, and he threatens her quite violently. Here is what Odysseus has to say to her when she recognizes him. Be quiet, keep it from the others, else I warn you, and I mean it too. If by my hands God brings the suitors down, I'll kill you, nurse or not, when the time comes to kill the other women. It's like, okay, calm down, dude. This is, I cannot reiterate enough, the nurse who cared for him when he was a child, and this is his reaction to seeing her again after 20 years of exile. Odysseus does not ever calm down at any point in this story. And so you might be like, why? Because clearly you could ask a question of whether or not the suitors deserved to die, or whether or not all of Odysseus' actions were justified in the context of the story. But there is also another way to look at this, which is why the poet chose to include all of this, why the poet chose to make the Nostos section of the story, where Odysseus is infiltrating his house, such a massive part of the text. The overall impression I get of this last part of the story, of all this artifice and distrustfulness, is that the world of the Odyssey is not a safe world. It's like the violation of xenia, the Greek principle of hospitality, which is so omnipresent in this story, by the suitors who are feasting on Odysseus's cattle and ruining his home. And also the violation of xenia that started the Trojan War in the first place has resulted in a world which is no longer safe, which is no longer hospitable, and a world which is resultantly in conflict constantly, where domestic struggles are just as dangerous as the struggles of the battlefield. And on that note, I can't help but be reminded of the way that Homer, in this book, but especially in the Iliad, draws a lot of explicit comparisons between domestic life and life on the battlefield, between the struggle of combat and the struggle of a hunt or the struggle of a harvest. These are passages that are sometimes referred to as Homeric similes, and they're constantly in the Iliad. To give you a random example, here's a section from Book 11 of the Iliad, which is describing the opening of a battle. And the men like gangs of reapers slashing down the reaping rows and coming closer, closer across the field of a warlord, rich in wheat and barley, swaths by the armfuls, falling thick and fast. So Achaeans and Trojans closed and slashed, lunging into each other, and neither side now had a thought of flight that would have meant disaster. Here there's a direct parallel drawn between the struggle of a successful harvest and the struggle of combat. And there are other examples that are a lot more violent, the ones that draw comparisons between the Greek heroes and lions or other beasts who are hunting prey, or hunters who are hunting prey. You get the sense that there is just this constant cruelty and strife in the world of the Iliad and the Odyssey, a cruelty which is represented on Achilles' own shield, which depicts the struggles of combat and the struggles of domestic life, all in a great circle. Scenes of battling armies share space with scenes of agriculture and marriage and hunting, as if to suggest that all of these aspects of life are just kind of manifestations of the same essential thing. There are a lot of other weird details in this poem that had me asking questions I wasn't planning on asking. Like, for example, I didn't understand what the poet's relationship with the swineherd Eumaeus was. Because whenever Eumaeus is introduced in a scene, the poet always goes, "Oh, my swineherd," and refers to him directly in the second person, as if he is talking to Eumaeus, as if the reader is Eumaeus. He says, "You, Eumaeus, oh my swineherd, you heard me, you listened to me." And I thought maybe this was a quirk of the translation I was reading. I'm reading the Robert Fitzgerald translation, incidentally. But no, I looked it up, and this is just a feature of the poem that nobody can really explain. Another one of those artistic choices, the context of which is just lost to time. There's also the question of why the story ends so abruptly. Why does it end with this scene where Odysseus and his squad are about to go fight this group of people who want to avenge the suitors' deaths until Athena comes in and puts a stop to it, and then that's it? But then there are some other questions that are sometimes brought up by this poem that I don't really think are the most important questions to be asking about it. Like, for example, it's very popular to speculate about whether the Apologos section of the story, books 9 through 12, where all of the fantastical creatures and fantastical places are present, but not elsewhere in the story, it's very popular to speculate about whether the events in that section actually happened, or whether Odysseus is making it all up as he's recounting it to Alcinous. I don't really think that this is an interesting question, because every time Odysseus tells a lie in the story is very transparent about it. There's this great bit in, I believe, the Emily Wilson translation, where she writes, "Lying Odysseus replied, 'I will tell you the truth completely,'" which is a perfect example of what I'm talking about. The poet doesn't really try to hide anything from you as the reader, and that's an important feature of the poet's style, which I'll get back to talking about in a second. And aside from that, the poet does refer to the events that happened in the Apologos in other sections of the story, and also the whole thing with Tiresias telling him about how he needs to get home is referenced at the very end of the story, so it wouldn't really make sense if he just made up the whole journey to the underworld. And also, what would it even add to the story if he did make it all up? What would Odysseus even be trying to achieve by lying to his host like that? I don't buy the idea that the Apologos is just made up. I think that's kind of a silly debate. Okay, so I had to go somewhere earlier, so I'm filming the rest of this video at night. Just ignore the lighting and costume change. Anyway, what I've been getting at is that there are a lot of weird choices in the Odyssey that the poet makes, which don't really line up with modern storytelling conventions, and it's kind of unclear what reaction we're supposed to have to these choices and what the context was in which those choices were made. There's a lot about this poem which is kind of mysterious, and I think a lot of my thoughts about Homer after reading both the Iliad and the Odyssey didn't really click into place until I read the first chapter of a certain book called Mimesis by Erich Auerbach. Mimesis is a book about, as the subtitle proclaims, the representation of reality in Western literature, tracing the development of the way in which authors use the styles available to them at the time in order to represent the real world on the world of the page, tracing that development from Homer all the way to Virginia Woolf. Now, I haven't read the full book yet, but the first chapter of the book is the one that is really important for the purposes of this video because it's the one that focuses on Homer. And Auerbach is basically making the case that the Homeric style is not a style that lends itself to hidden details. Everything which exists in the world of the Odyssey and the Iliad, everything which is true about that universe, is presented to the reader front and center for us to see. He describes the worlds that we are presented with in Homer as a uniformly objective present, and he contrasts this world with the world presented in another work of literature that came out at roughly the same time, came out as if they're like albums. He compares the works of Homer with the book of Genesis in the Hebrew Bible, and he demonstrates how, in contrast to the Homeric style, the style in which the book of Genesis is written leaves a lot of details up to the reader's imagination, whereas Homer will go into great lengths to describe every detail of the environments in which the characters are present. He'll describe the shape of every room, the decorative details on every vase and on every piece of armor, and importantly, the thoughts going around in everybody's head. In Genesis, a lot of that is left kind of mysterious. There are conversations happening where it's not always entirely clear where the characters are standing. There are communications happening between God and Abraham where it's not entirely possible to imagine what a conversation like that might look like, which is very different from the way that the gods appear as physical people in the Iliad and Odyssey. And he uses the imagery of light to compare these two styles, describing the Homeric style as uniformly illuminated. In the Homeric worlds, every nook and cranny of physical space and of every character's mind and their conscience is lit up for the reader to see. Whereas in Genesis, that's not the case at all. People's intentions can be hidden, physical details are often left vague, and the way in which time is handled in these two styles is also very different. The passage he focuses on in this first chapter of Mimesis is the scene that I talked about earlier where Eurykleia recognizes Odysseus. And the reason he focuses on this particular passage is because in this scene, there is an extended, what you might call flashback sequence that describes how Odysseus got the scar that Eurykleia recognizes. But the interesting thing about this sequence, along with every other flashback sequence in these poems, and even the extended Homeric similes that I talked about earlier, is that they're not placed in a subjunctive relationship to the rest of the story. It would seem by our modern standards to be a very odd choice to interrupt a dramatic scene like this with an extended flashback sequence like that, especially one which is just as detailed as the scene that we were just reading. But that's what Auerbach is talking about when he's talking about a uniformly objective present in this poem. As he writes, Homer knows no background. What he narrates is for the time being the only present and fills both the stage and the reader's mind completely. Just like the different layers of life, domestic life and military life, are placed alongside each other physically on Achilles' shield, the different layers of time in the Odyssey, the past, present, and the future, are all kind of blended together. It's very easy when reading a particular passage to forget about the relationship that that passage has to the rest of the poem. And this is even true in the sections of the poem that are narrated by the characters themselves, like the famous Apologos section that I talked about earlier, and also the section where Menelaus describes his encounter with Proteus. The style of the poem doesn't change very little. Now, this is where I should say that I read this in translation, so obviously I'm not familiar with the ancient Greek, and I can't really attest to what the style is like in the original language. But insofar as the translation I read is accurate, and insofar as Auerbach is correct, and I'm assuming he probably reads ancient Greek, there is very little distinction to be made between the characters' voices and the poet's voice. Characters all kind of talk the same way. There are no colloquialisms, there are no distinctive dialects, and as a result, when you're reading the passages that Odysseus is narrating, you kind of just forget that you're reading a passage that he's narrating. You forget the relationship that this part of the story has to the rest of the story. And because of the uniformly illuminated nature of the details in the Homeric style, there is very little room for characters to hide information from the reader. This is why I was saying that I don't think that the Apologos sections of the poem are a fabrication on Odysseus's part. The nature of truth in this poem is very direct, very on the nose. And one of the very noticeable effects of this is that the emotions that characters have are very powerful, very direct, and very simple. In short, there's not much psychoanalysis going on here. Turning back to Auerbach, Auerbach says concerning the Homeric heroes, their destiny is clearly defined, and they wake every morning as if it were the first day of their lives. Their emotions, though strong, are simple and find expression instantly. Basically, Homer really wants to make sure you get it. He doesn't want anybody in the dark, he wants to make sure you're all on the same page. He does this to an extent that almost feels like over-explaining sometimes by today's standards. Like a really funny example is, just after Odysseus returns home, and Athena tells him that Telemachus has gone out looking for him, Odysseus asks her, hey, why did you send Telemachus out looking for me if you could have just told him where I was and told him that I was on my way home? And Athena is kind of like, well, Telemachus needed to become a man in his own right. He needed to become a hero, so I sent him out on this dangerous journey. And I thought this was so funny because it's almost like Odysseus is doing like a little cinema sins thing, like, actually, why did Telemachus have to go out searching for me if the gods could have just told him in the first place? And Homer seems to have anticipated that the listeners would ask this question and preemptively answers it. Now, again, we don't really know what this style was meant to achieve because a lot of the cultural context is missing. For my part, I found that all of these details of the Homeric style that I've been describing help to carry the narrative along with a certain sense of inevitability. After you've been reading Homer for long enough, it starts to have this hypnotic effect on you where you just get really invested in whatever particular random thing Homer is describing, and you kind of forget about why he's describing this or why it matters. And as I've said, there are so many random tangents and non sequiturs and lengthy descriptions in Homer, it would be really easy to start wondering what all of these asides have to do with anything, if it wasn't for this style carrying everything along with the same rushing pulse. And this effect, I should note, is heightened if you listen to the poem in the original language, which, again, obviously I can't understand, but if you go on YouTube and you listen to people who are reading the Odyssey or the Iliad in ancient Greek, you can feel the effect of the dactylic hexameter, the meter in which this poem was written, and how it has this rhythm almost like that of galloping hooves. It feels like this tide of fate just rushing over you. And on the subject of inevitability, I think that connects not just to the style in which the poem was written, but also to the particular details in the narrative itself, especially the use of omens in the story. There are a lot of omens in the Odyssey. In fact, there are so many omens that there are almost no opportunities for the reader to speculate about what's going to happen next in the story, because you already know. The story tells you beforehand. This is not a suspenseful poem. It's almost like an anti-suspenseful poem. Homer wants to make really sure you get into your head that the suitors are going to be taken over by Odysseus. He has like 5 or 6 different omens, one after another, predicting that the suitors are going to die. Most of these omens are bird related, like somebody will see a small bird getting taken over by a larger bird and be like, oh, this is going to be like Odysseus, he's going to come home and he's going to kill all the suitors, you know? And it's like Homer really wants to make sure that you do not doubt for even a second that the suitors deserve to die for what they've done. He doesn't want you questioning at all the inevitability or the rightfulness of what is going to happen. And this creates kind of a weird friction because, as I've said before, I was not entirely convinced, based on the details of the story, that all of the suitors needed to die, certainly that all of the slave women needed to die, and yet the persistent usage of these omens in the narrative is really trying to get that drilled into your head that they do deserve to die. No, like, this is like woven into the fabric of the universe, that Odysseus is going to kill these people and it's going to be great and it's going to be righteous and it's going to be awesome. Funnily enough, one of the only scenes where something genuinely unexpected happens in the story is the scene with Eurykleia that I've been talking about. When Eurykleia recognizes Odysseus, that was not part of the god's plan. There was no omen that was foretelling that. And indeed, that's why Odysseus is so freaked out when it happens. But even then, the gods immediately swoop in to take everything under control. Athena shields Penelope's eyes from recognizing what is happening, and so immediately everything is kind of normal again. My camera died last night, so this is now my 3rd attempt to finish filming this video, which seems to have become an odyssey in itself. Anyway, I wanted to conclude that despite everything I've been saying over the course of this whole video, I don't want to oversell the alienating nature of this text. There is still a lot about this story which is comprehensible, especially in the way that characters show emotions. Odysseus cries a lot in this poem, and not in a ritualistic way. He very often tries to stop himself from crying, but is unable to hold back the tears. There's a very moving scene near the end of the poem when he reunites with his father, and he tries to keep up the little charade going with him that he's been doing with everybody else, where he's trying to test him and see if he's been loyal, but he's unable to hold back the tears. He can't keep the charade going. The reunion between Odysseus and his son is very moving in a similar way, as is his reunion with Eurykleia, at least until the point where he randomly threatens to kill her. And that's the thing about this poem, is that all of these human moments, these moments that we recognize as familiar, are immediately interrupted by some moment of culture shock. An example from the Iliad, I'm talking a lot about the Iliad in this video, that's supposed to be about the Odyssey, but whatever. In the Iliad, just after Patroclus dies, the Achaeans decide to honor him by having a sports competition, which is seemingly a pretty common thing back then. And Homer goes into a lot of detail about all of these various competitions and the struggle and the strife involved, and the characters getting into disputes with each other about who won and so on. And from a modern perspective, it seems like this takes away from the gravitas of the moment, but that's just the thing with Homer. You just have to accept that there are going to be these long-winded, seemingly superfluous sections. That's just part of the style, and that's part of the culture. Overall, this poem, the rigid style in which it is written, the uniform way in which it is structured, it feels like an attempt to make order out of an inherently chaotic universe. Even though the narrative itself is very convoluted and chaotic and strife-driven, the overall events of the story are still driven by omens and fate, and you get the impression that things happen because they must happen, not because of random chance. And so there's this weird tension at the core of the story where there is no moral arc to the universe, and yet everything still is moving inevitably towards a certain point. It's like fate is woven into every layer of reality, such that the fate of a smaller bird getting caught by a larger bird is simply another manifestation of the fate of rambunctious suitors in the face of a returning hero. All of this can make these ancient works somewhat less enjoyable to read nowadays, but on the other hand, how disappointing would it be if ancient works were immediately comprehensible to us, if there wasn't this immense culture shock, if there wasn't a little bit of alienation? These inexplicable details are kind of how we know the work is authentic. Anyway, I have run out of things to say, so I should probably wrap this up now, but thank you for watching. I do hope you'll tune in next time for whatever random book I end up talking about next. In the meantime, thank you, and see you later. Have a great day.